Welcome to the 8th lecture in the series to celebrate the 50th anniversary of John Rawls' publication on a theory of justice. In the past lectures, we have seen several questions related to migration, welfare state, and the like. And today we have a lecture specifically focusing on the question of identity and that of the gender. We have Ruth Abbey, who has worked extensively on the question, taking on the liberal feminists, and particularly her work on John Rawls' ideas and feminist interpretation of John Rawls has been influential. And we are very glad that she has agreed to speak to us as well as to converse with us in the second part of this today's morning. As many of you know, you don't need a long introduction to Ruth Abbey. She is currently chair, Department of Social Science at Swinburne Technological University. Beyond that, her works while she was in US and UK have all been centered around the question of feminism, and that also on the works of Friedrich Nietzsche. As the lecture progresses, we hope to point out some of the works that she has published in this field in the chat box. And also feel free to post some questions on chat box as the lecture is proceeding. We could take them up in our discussions as we move on. So welcome, Ruth, and over to you, and we are eager to listen to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for attending. I'll assume that unless someone signals otherwise that you're able to hear me clearly. And I have also promised to endeavor to enunciate very clearly, because I do appreciate that I have a different accent from many of you. Having lived in the UK, I was constantly being picked up about my accent. Having lived in the US, I was constantly being picked up about my accent and asked to repeat myself. And of course, now being back in Australia, I'm still picked up on my accent, even though I am Australian, because it's changed from my years living abroad. So I'm very used to people not being able to understand me when I speak too quickly. So I will try to enunciate as clearly as I possibly can. But again, please let me know if you're having trouble understanding or hearing anything that I am saying. As Sonny mentioned, I just popped into the chat box a reference to some of the pieces that I have written on the topic for today's conversation. I'll be referring to those as we go. So I thought that rather than repeat that information, I would just have it available for you there to hand. And at the end of the session, I thought I'd also drop in some of the other things that I have written about Rawls. Oh, someone's just said, Sony, they're not able to see that document. Will you be able to take care of that?
Yes, I will post some of them here.
Okay, thanks for letting us know. And well, towards the end, in some way, I will make available to you some of the other things that I've written about Rawls that aren't necessarily about Rawls and gender, but perhaps in their own way, they're influenced by my work on Rawls and gender, or connected to it in some ways. I have, for example, just recently finished a piece on the topic of Rawls and friendship. And that's a very unusual topic. And I think that it has come about in part because of my previous work on Rawls and feminism. Okay, so I also need to apologize if I look distracted. I'm working on a very small laptop and I only have one computer at home, so I have to switch my gaze from the camera to my notes. So I do apologize if I look like I'm distracted. I'm not. I want to applaud this group for taking the time to celebrate the 50th anniversary of a theory of justice. I've been involved in a couple of other forms of celebrating this book, but nothing quite like this series of seminars. So I think that's really a fabulous idea. And it's a book that really warrants this attention, I believe. A theory of justice strikes me as a gift that just keeps on giving. I've been reading it for some years now, and every time I go back and think that I understand something about the book, I find something new and surprising. So it really is an amazingly generative work, I think. It's a sort of work that gets older and mature more mature as its readers get older and more mature, always a sign of a good book. And I think that the size and the scope of Rawls's project in that book is really something to behold. I mean, whether you agree with what Rawls says in A Theory of Justice or not, the sheer magnitude, the sheer ambition of the book is really quite breathtaking, I think. And by the time you get to the end of the book, the way in which all its various parts are supposed to fit together, I always think of it as something of an aesthetic achievement as well as an intellectual achievement. It really is a thing of beauty in its own way. And as I said, I say that no matter what one thinks about the contents. And I think that the way it combines that massive scope and ambition with the very poised and carefully manicured paragraphs that make up the whole book is really just remarkable. So I take my hat off to Rawls's achievement with that book. I think it's hard to think of anything that rivals that in 20th century political philosophy. So just for the size of his project and his achievement alone, he really deserves a lot of the attention that he gets, I think. And as I said, it's very hard to nail down that book. When you go back to it, you find something new or different or surprising. So as I said, I think whether or not you agree with him, we have to start from the premise that Rawls was really a remarkable thinker. And then to think that he finished A Theory of Justice, put his pen down, and then took it up again to start engaging with his critics and to start modifying and correcting that work is really, that's also extraordinary, I think. And maybe there are people in the audience, perhaps a little bit like me, who think that he should maybe have stopped at the end of A Theory of Justice. It's something I'd be happy to talk about when we get to the question and answer period, if people like, about whether his later modifications and amendments to A Theory of Justice actually constitute improvements to the work or not. But it's really just remarkable that he would finish this book and then start engaging the criticisms and start modifying that work, and then of course branching out into The Law of Peoples. The Law of Peoples strikes me as, I think, the least successful of his endeavors, but nonetheless, one has to admire his the very undertaking to try to apply his theory to the international system. Yet for all my very genuine admiration of Rawls, it's not uncritical, as you'll see. I do have some reservations about some of the things that he says. And one of the things that I found a little bit difficult, I must say, about my engagement with other Rawls scholars is that there's a slight tendency, I think, to treat political theory a bit like a spectator sport in which you have to barrack for one side or the other. And if you support one particular thinker, you have to do so uncritically. And if you support another thinker, you can't at the same time enjoy that first thinker. So I do feel that I occupy a slightly unusual territory in the sense that I combine massive admiration for Rawls and his achievements with some also quite significant reservations and further questions about the things that he has said to us. So in asking me to prepare this seminar, Sonny gave me two questions to address. The first one was how Rawls's theory of justice has strengthened feminism. The second one was where Rawls has failed to address feminist concerns. So let me turn first to the first question. How has the Rawlsian theory of justice strengthened feminism? On the one hand, I would say not much. And that is, if we're thinking about feminism in general, I think that Rawls's theory has made very little dent into feminism in general. And part of the reason for that is that obviously Rawls fits into the approach that would be considered liberal feminism, or my preferred term, which I'll explain in a moment, feminist liberalism, is in the current environment a fairly, it's not the mainstream of feminism. Many feminist theorists would think of themselves, rightly or wrongly, as critics of liberalism. So as a liberal thinker, Rawls's impact on contemporary feminism has been fairly limited. However, if we're just talking about the subfield of contemporary feminism, which is feminist liberalism, then the answer to the question, how great has his impact been, is it has been quite large. In my 2011 book, The Return of Feminist Liberalism, I focus on three thinkers who self-describe as feminist liberals. They are Susan Oken, Jean Hampton, and Martha Nussbaum. Oken and Hampton no longer living, Nussbaum very much alive and continuing to publish. The impact of Rawls on their thinking cannot be exaggerated. So if we just answer the question by qualifying it to be what is the impact of Rawls on contemporary feminist liberalism, then it's really massive. And one of the very interesting things that I found when I was writing that book is that although those three thinkers draw inspiration from Rawls, they do so in quite different ways. They pick up different aspects of his thinking, or they interpret those aspects they take them in different directions. So just because all of those three thinkers have been heavily influenced by Rawls, it doesn't mean that they're all carbon copies of one another. Oken, Hampton, and Nussbaum each carves out her own distinctive form of Rawlsian inflected feminist liberalism. So my answer, to summarize to that first question, is that we need to break it down. Very large impact on contemporary feminist liberalism, not much dent on feminist scholarship outside of that. The answer to the second question, where has Rawls failed to address feminist concerns, is a bit more complicated for reasons that I'll develop below. But one of the major areas of neglect in Rawls's thinking that's really inescapable in contemporary feminism is the whole issue of intersectionality, which we can summarize very inadequately as grappling with the question, how can we accurately and safely generalize about women? We have to take into account all the other aspects of gender identity that are affected by a person's race, by their religion, by their ethnicity, by their class, by their age, by their nationality, and so forth. So that style of thinking, which is really, I would say, almost just taken for granted in contemporary feminism, is not something that Rawls really helps us with, I don't think. I have argued in the book on the return of feminist liberalism that we can derive resources from that tradition to help us think about intersectionality, but it's not something that Rawls himself addresses head on. It's just not something that was really on his radar at all. So to continue the conversation, I thought what I might do is just modify the questions a little bit. And instead of asking what Rawls has given to feminism, I thought I might talk about what reading Rawls through a feminist lens does to the way we read Rawls. So rather than what does Rawls bring to feminism, what does feminism bring to our understanding of Rawls? So in addressing that slightly modified question, I'll organize my response in 3 sections and just briefly talk about the 3 contributions I've made to that conversation. And I'll end with some brief remarks about more recent scholarship as well. And then I'll try to summarize what I think have been some of the really important legacies of feminist scholarship on Rawls for Rawlsian scholarship in general. But I thought it might be helpful to just start by describing my own journey into this scholarly area. I had written a book on Nietzsche in 2000, and also in that same year published a book on Charles Taylor. So I was not, on the face of it, a likely or indeed a qualified candidate to start writing about Rawls, and certainly not to start writing about Rawls appreciatively. If you just describe that pedigree to someone, they would expect you'd get a critique of Rawls coming from that background. But I'd also written a piece about Mary Wollstonecraft, her feminism and her views on marriage and the family. And so that style of thinking, getting into that tradition, did prime me a bit more for the journey I was about to undertake into the question of Rawls and gender. But just let me make an aside on that and explain some of why I think that I would, on the face of it, look like an unlikely candidate to embark on this journey. Rawls and Nietzsche are very different type of thinkers in all sorts of ways. I mean, Rawls is, for better or worse, a system builder, and Nietzsche clearly is not. Nietzsche is, at least in my reading, and I understand that this is a widely contested approach, Nietzsche, as I read him, is an anti-liberal thinker and would repudiate root and branch the egalitarianism that is fundamental to justice as fairness. So it's easy to see the antagonism between Nietzsche and Rawls. The connection between Rawls and Charles Taylor is much more complicated, I would argue. So Taylor is no system builder either, and that distinguishes him from Rawls. But Taylor and Rawls are both egalitarian thinkers. And I would say that despite the misleading framing of the liberal communitarian debate, there are many ways in which Charles Taylor is appreciative of many elements of liberalism. So there's much more of a shared agenda and outlook between him and Rawls than there is between Nietzsche and Rawls. And indeed, I've just written a very short piece for a publication that's celebrating Charles Taylor's 90th birthday, which is this year, where I go back and track his early appreciation of a theory of justice. Taylor had quite a few very positive things to say about a theory of justice when it was published, and many of his critiques of liberalism are not targeted directly at Rawls. So in my view, at least, Taylor and Rawls are not at loggerheads in the way that they are frequently presented to be in so much of the secondary literature. Both Taylor and Rawls are much more interesting in regard to one another than the typical liberal communitarian caricatures allow us to see. So now I'll go back to talk about how I started down this track of Rawls and feminism, and Charles Taylor plays something of a role in that too. In the early 2000s, I'd moved to take a job in the UK at the University of Canterbury, and I was teaching a new course on liberalism and its critics. So we started with a theory of justice, and then we looked at some of the responses and criticisms of a theory of justice week by week. And of course, one of the weeks in that course was devoted to Susan Oken's criticism of Rawls. And then I moved on, once we'd done a theory of justice, once we'd done the critical responses, then I moved on to talk about political liberalism and the various ways in which Rawls engaged with his critics. And I was merrily talking away about this. And one student put up her hand and said, "But you haven't talked about his response to Susan Oken and the feminist critique of a theory of justice. What is it?" And I thought, That's a good question. And I don't really have a very good answer at this point. So I said that to the student, and I set about trying to answer her question. That's where my voyage into Rawls and feminism came from a very insightful question from an undergraduate student in a class that I was teaching. My first attempt to answer the student's question was an article published in Political Theory in 2007. There I looked at the ways in which Rawls did and didn't respond to feminist critiques of a theory of justice. Of course, those critiques are not confined to Susan Oken, but she is the best known, and her critique was really the most sustained feminist response to a theory of justice. And the first thing we have to say is that there's very little by way of response to the feminist critiques in political liberalism. Of all the other criticisms that Rawls takes up, he pays very little attention to this apart from a passing remark. That changes somewhat when we get to the idea of public reason revisited and section 5, which talks about the family, the role of the family as part of the basic structure. And then those ideas appear again, of course, in Justice as Fairness, a restatement. I won't go into the nitty-gritty of my argument here, but suffice it to say that in those sections where Rawls takes on his feminist interlocutors, he insists by saying that all members of the just society carry their rights and freedoms as citizens with them at all times and in all places. That very strong statement potentially goes a long way towards addressing some of the feminist liberal concerns that came out in response to his work. And of course, the potential for that strong response grows out of the fact that Rawls locates the family in the basic structure. I mean, scholars are still debating what that actually means, but the fact that he even makes that move to put the family within the institutions of the basic structure, to which the first and second principles of justice apply in some way, and I understand that how they apply is something that's debated in the literature. Nonetheless, that very strong move is what provides a lot of the potential, feminist potential, in Justice as Fairness. And of course, this is what excited Oken very much about her reading of A Theory of Justice. Even if she misinterpreted what Rawls intended by this, this is the reason that she saw such great potential in his work for feminist purposes, in stark contrast to most other thinkers in the liberal tradition, with the obvious exception of John Stuart Mill, and of course the history of Western political thought more generally, where the family had largely been neglected and relegated to the private sphere if it was addressed at all. So that's part of the answer to the student's question about how does Rawls respond. But I go on in that article to say that no matter how encouraging that response might be, it is complicated, or at least it complicates his attempt to develop a distinction between comprehensive and political liberalisms. Because when we juxtapose what he says in those writings about what it actually means for women to be bearers of these rights and freedoms and to be constituted by them in most or all areas of their lives, it becomes apparent, at least to me, that more than a political liberalism is required for the full incorporation of women as free and equal persons in the doctrine of justice and fairness. I conclude from this that the incorporation of women as subjects of justice has the unintended consequence of pushing justice as fairness back in the direction of a comprehensive rather than a strictly political form of liberalism. And I would argue that when Rawls's views on women are fully incorporated and appreciated, his liberalism is best understood as a reasonable, partly comprehensive doctrine rather than a purely political form of liberalism. That is probably not the outcome that he would have wanted, and it's not the outcome that all feminist interpreters see. But as I argue in that piece, the evidence seems pretty strong to me. And I would argue, and I'd be more than happy to talk with people about this in the Q&A section, is that this is probably what Rawls has always been: a reasonable, partly comprehensive liberal. Even though he didn't have that terminology in A Theory of Justice, I think that's the correct way to characterize a theory of justice. And so if I'm right about this, and not everyone agrees with me, what it means is that the whole move to political liberalism doesn't succeed if you're talking about justice as fairness in a way that includes women. And I won't even go down the track of what it means for children, because very interestingly, Rawls repeatedly refers to children as future citizens, not current citizens. We can talk about that if people want to. I don't want to get sidetracked by that at the moment. And in that article, I also make the even more controversial claim that any form of feminist liberalism probably has to be a partly comprehensive form of liberalism, that you're not going to get feminism out of political liberalism. And as I said, many feminist interpreters disagree with me on that. So I picked up that more controversial thesis that any form of liberalism, or Rawlsian liberalism, that's going to be hospitable to feminist concerns probably has to be a partly comprehensive doctrine, and explored it then in my 2011 book, The Return of Feminist Liberalism. And let me just take a moment here to talk about my somewhat unconventional coinage, why I use the term feminist liberalism rather than liberal feminism. It might sound pedantic, and I would understand if people thought that that was the case. But I refer to people like Oken, Nussbaum, and Hampton as feminist liberals rather than liberal feminists, because their feminism qualifies their liberalism rather than their liberalism qualifying their feminism. What I mean by that is that these thinkers are in many ways liberals first, and then they're feminists through their liberalism. Or to put it a bit more affirmatively, these theorists would argue that any sort of liberalism that was not accommodating of women as free and equal subjects of justice would be falling short of its own liberalism. That a genuine form of liberalism would have to be something that incorporated feminist insights and concerns, and as I said, women's equality and liberty. So that's why I use that somewhat unusual coinage, because their feminism is very intimately attached to their liberalism, rather than being feminist first and then deciding that they'll take a liberal approach to that. It's also the case that the term liberal feminism has a lot of negative connotations around it in feminist scholarship. And so this is potentially a way of avoiding some of those connotations. Those connotations are very often based on what I think is a fairly impoverished view of the liberal feminist tradition anyway. So that book starts by exploring feminist critiques of liberalism, to see how valid they are, where they come from, and to ask whether liberalism has the resources for addressing the criticisms that feminists have leveled at it for decades now. As I indicated, it looks in detail at three of Rawls's feminist legatees, Susan Oken, Jean Hampton, and Martha Nussbaum. And interestingly, for my purposes at least, of those three, it's really only Nussbaum who cleaves to a version of political liberalism. The other two come up with different versions of partly comprehensive liberalism, at least as I interpret them. And what I found in the book was that those three authors are very cognizant of the decades of feminist criticism of liberalism that we have seen, And yet their response to those criticisms is not to jettison liberalism, but to look for resources within the liberal tradition to try to address those concerns. They don't want to dismiss liberalism as being hopeless for feminist purposes. The realization that grew out of that book for me about how incredibly influential Rawls had been in the development of these three thinkers' work then led me into the next project, which was editing the book, Feminist Interpretations of Rawls. And I remember very clearly the Sunday morning, I was in an airport coming back from a conference and was just thinking a bit about Rawls and feminism. And I thought, oh, I wonder if they've already devoted one of these volumes to Rawls. And I thought, oh, I'm sure they must have. They must have. So I started Googling and I couldn't see one. And I thought, well, there must be one in the works. It's such an obvious thing for someone to do, given Rawls's incredible stature. So I just emailed the series editor and I said, oh, look, I assume someone's doing this, but can you just confirm, is one of these in process? And Nancy Tawana wrote back and said, no, there isn't. Would you like to submit a proposal? So I duly went about that. And in preparing that book, I went for a really wide spectrum of feminist interpretations of Rawls. It combines people who are quite fiercely critical of Rawls to others who are sympathetic. And then there's a medium ground of those who really admire some things about Rawls while also being critical of others. Those who look for his potential, for example, Elizabeth Brake's chapter on the feminist potential of the idea of self-respect as a primary good, and so forth. My own contribution to that book was to do an editor's introduction. And rather than just do the standard editor's introduction where I summarize each of the chapters, I set myself the really fascinating task of trying to talk about all of the English language feminist responses to Rawls from a theory of justice up to the time in which I was writing the introduction. And so I just found all of them that I could. It's possible that I missed some, but I haven't come across any that I've missed yet, but they may be out there. And so I just wrote what I called a biography of that bibliography. I went through chronologically to see what feminists had said about Rawls from the early publication of A Theory of Justice right up to the time that I was writing. And what that exercise, what that project really revealed was that feminists have been very actively involved with Rawls from the publication of A Theory of Justice right through, but that there are so many different positions and responses to Rawls. It's really interesting. It means that it's a bit inaccurate to generalize about the feminist response to Rawls, other than to say there's been quite a lot of it. So at the time that I published that book, which was 2013, my editor's introduction, the biography of a bibliography, was, as far as I could see, fairly comprehensive. But since then, a couple of things have come out, and I'll just briefly summarize those and then head towards the end of my presentation so that we can start having questions and conversation. In 2018, we saw the publication of a major work on Rawls and feminism. That's a book by Christy Hartley and Laurie Watson entitled Equal Citizenship and Public Reason. The subtitle of their book indicates that they set out to vindicate a purely political liberalism for feminist purposes. And they're not alone in this. There has been a strand of feminist reception of Rawls and feminist interpretation of Rawls that has sought to disagree with me and say that political liberalism is purely adequate for feminist purposes. An important voice in that has been Sharon Lloyd, for example. Amy Baer is another one, and there have been others. So Hartley and Watson are not alone, but I think they've made the major contribution thus far to that attempt to say that political liberalism is sufficient for Rawlsian feminism. They and Martha Nussbaum. Of course, Nussbaum's position is a little bit more idiosyncratic because of the way she folds her capabilities approach into that. So that's what Hartley and Watson set out to do in that book. But I have to say that I find the way they structure their presentation a little bit unusual. The book's divided into two halves, and the first half is chapters devoted to Rawlsian interpretation, and the second half is chapters devoted to feminist applications. And it would have seemed to me that if you were trying to vindicate the Rawls for feminism, you would combine those two things in a more obvious way. So that seemed a strange choice for them to make to me. I also have some questions about whether their very definition of political liberalism makes the argument a bit circular. They claim that any genuine form of political liberalism must secure substantive equality for women and other marginalized groups. And if they're right about that, then it's not a great surprise that political liberalism and feminism are friends. But that seems to me to be a particular definition of political liberalism. It's one that others might contest. And my question all along with this approach is, if that is what political liberalism is all about, then that is going to compromise the very pluralism of reasonable comprehensive doctrines that political liberalism set out to host in the first place. So again, I admire their achievement, but it's not something I'm entirely persuaded by. But then the second major work that has come out recently about Rawls and feminism, is a work by Gina Schouten. It appeared in 2019. It's called Liberalism, Neutrality, and the Gender Division of Labour. Her focus is the gendered nature of caring work and the ways in which this can impede the realization of justice in society. So she takes up, although not always explicitly, many of the themes that Susan Oken raised in her first response to A Theory of Justice. By casting the gender division of labour as a matter of justice, Schouten can ask, what can the liberal state do to promote gender egalitarianism in the household? She finds that political liberalism provides a framework for thinking about legitimate government policy in this regard. And in particular, she emphasizes the values that citizens share regarding conceptions of the right. So she invokes political liberalism's ideals of reciprocity, mutual respect, mutual justifiability, equal citizenship, and legitimacy. And that gives you some flavor of why she thinks political liberalism is up to the task of doing this. So again, she joins Hartley and Watson as a more recent defender of political liberalism for feminist purposes. So by way of wrapping up my presentation here, I'll just make a few general points. The first one is that it's really helpful to be aware of the benefits of feminist engagement with justice as fairness. It's not a sidebar, it's not a specialist concern. The feminist scholarship on justice as fairness has raised myriad important issues and contributes to some of those important and recognized issues from fresh perspectives. For example, these issues include things such as how meaningful the political comprehensive distinction that Rawls generated post A Theory of Justice is, whether the development of political liberalism is an advance in his corpus or not, what sort of entity the Rawlsian individual is, what the role of sociality is in justice as fairness, and of course, what the role of the family is in forming a just society, what the two principles of justice might mean when we apply them, and what the pros and cons of doing ideal theory about politics are. So Rawls as feminist interpreters raise all those questions and more, and all of them are really pressing question in Rawls' interpretation and scholarship. But as I said, one of the questions that it raises for me, really, coming to the end of this, is, was A Theory of Justice ever a fully comprehensive doctrine in the first place? And I even wonder whether any liberal has been fully comprehensive, any liberal political theorist has been fully comprehensive, because I don't think Mill is, for reasons I can talk about, and I don't think Kant is. And yet they're the two candidates that Rawls puts forward as comprehensive liberals. But if Rawls was not, if Rawls is not a fully comprehensive theorist in the first place, and if he does remain a reasonable, partly comprehensive liberal in the way that I think he does, I kind of wonder where the whole trip through political liberalism has gotten us. Anyway, I'll stop on that note and hand over to other people.
Thank you, Ruth. That was a very useful overview on feminism with John Rawls' theories. And also you brought in your personal journey of how you began with it and how you have evolved into different ways of thinking about critiques of feminism. Thank you for that wonderful overview. We have several participants wanting to ask questions. If participant could introduce yourself briefly before you get into your question, it will be very useful for Ruth. So Ashish, would you like to begin with your question? You are on mute, Ashish. You'll have to unmute.
Oh, so is your question in the chat then? Sorry, I haven't been able to look at any of the questions in the chat. So maybe if your question's in the chat, we can find it.
Yeah.
And
Hello.
I'll answer
Am I
audible
now? Yeah. Hello. So thank you for your wonderful talk. I was just wondering, like, one of the larger sort of critiques that I've always sort of seen that is hurled towards feminists is that they do strive rightly so towards an egalitarian society. But what happens in that process is that there is a tendency, as Ashish Nandi would say, that you try to emulate the dominant structure rather than giving your own unique perspective. So, my question was that can the liberal viewpoint provide a unique perspective for feminists, which is different from the dominant structure that of patriarchy or the larger male dominated society? So, in the larger corpus of justice, can we expect, or can we think of a more unique perspective coming from feminist viewpoints?
Okay, I had a bit of trouble hearing that, but let me just say what I think I heard you asking, and then I'll try to answer that. And if I've gotten it wrong, you can correct me. Does feminism provide a unique and distinctive perspective on justice and society that is in some ways insulated or separate from mainstream views?
Yes.
Was that the question?
Yes. That works.
It's a good question. I'm just racking my brains to try to think of whether there are any feminist examples of doing what you have just suggested. And it may be that there's some in feminist science fiction. I don't read science fiction, but from the little I hear about it, there might be some of that there. But I think feminist political theorists, maybe the person who's gone furthest in this direction is Catherine McKinnon. But even then, I'm not sure she's trying to articulate something that's unique and distinctive. Because if you're trying to operate within mainstream social structures, which McKinnon as a lawyer and legal theorist has been, you have to be able to speak that language. So if you brought in something that was too radical and too distinctive, you couldn't make your position known and you couldn't argue for improvement within the dominant vocabulary. Now, of course, there are feminists who argue that, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. But certainly the feminist liberals that I look at don't think that, because they think that the tools are just fine. They have been used in very limited, very selective ways so far, but the problem is not the tools themselves. And they mean by the tools, they mean things like the concept of equality, the concept of equal liberty, the concept of consent, the concept of power not being distributed arbitrarily. The feminist liberals that I read would not see a problem with any of those concepts. And indeed, many of the feminists that I'm familiar with in general admire those concepts too. They just don't always associate them with liberalism. So I think the answer to the question has got to be no. And it's no because of the very practical purposes that accompany a lot of feminist theorizing, which is trying to change the world now for the better for people who are disadvantaged by it.
Thank you. We have Anantagiri. Please raise your reflection or ask question, please.
Thank you, Ruth. It is a joy to listen to you, and greetings to all friends. I have a very few queries and I wish to submit it very quickly. With deep gratitude to your very deep engagement with both Rawls, feminism and liberalism, a question can be the whole challenge of liberation, that how do we embrace the multidimensional challenge of liberation vis-a-vis Rawls, justice, feminism, including feminist liberalism. Now, liberation is a multidimensional project, which also is not only institutional and structural, as Rawls talks about basic structure, but also it has an ontological dimension. And coming to the question of justice, you very kindly referred to Martha Nussbaum. Now, Nussbaum in her work, Frontiers of Justice, among other things, she talks about the challenge of cross-species dignity. And so in a way that how do we read Rawls from a theme like cross-species dignity, via embracing the question of climate justice, bringing social justice and climate justice together, which also raises a profound question to both conventional forms of feminism and Rawls, is the limits of anthropocentrism. And my query is that even feminist liberalism, is it grappling with the challenge of anthropocentrism and moving in the direction of a certain form of cross-species dignity in a spirit of liberation? That brings the third questions about family, as Rawls talks about. You raise the very question, what about children as current citizens? But to look at children as current citizens, is it also not a diminution of the potential of children? As Rousseau has already told us, that our identity is not only that of a citizen, and especially with crisis of citizenship. And that also brings us to a possible dialogue between Hannah Arendt and John Rawls, that the whole question of natality and the family as a space of generativity. But that generativity also poses the question of generation, the whole intergenerational conversation and responsibility also. And my concluding submission is the question of responsibility, that both Rawls, justice and liberalism, how does it embrace the challenge of responsibility in a way which includes liberalism and justice, but at the same time, in a way, it transcends both of them as a kind of a core.
Right, yeah. Well, just like liberalism, that itself was a multidimensional, just like liberation, that was a multidimensional question. And I'll do my best to pull out some of the parts and answer it. On the anthropocentrism question, it's a really good one. And clearly Nussbaum is trying to do that. Hampton and Oken are dead now, so can't pick up that side of the challenge to liberalism. And I don't see and this could just be my own ignorance, I don't see other people who've been influenced by Rawls picking this up. We can, of course, think about liberalism without Rawls. And so I've written a couple of pieces on animal ethics. And one of them is about resources within Rorty's form of liberalism for animal ethics. Another one is about resources within Judith Shklar's form of liberalism, particularly with its accent on cruelty. So, and I have written a piece about Rawls and animal ethics, but there, my aim is to show that there are more opportunities within a theory of justice than there are within political liberalism for thinking about animal ethics. And when I started going down this track, it was very interesting because one of the things that broke out quite early on after a theory of justice was a debate among people saying, is there a role for animals as subjects of justice in this? And that debate is continuing. It's happening not so much, I think, from Rawls' feminist legatees, apart from Nussbaum, but with other people like Robert Garner, arguing about whether political liberalism is going to be sufficient for securing protections and rights for animals. So the debate is happening to some extent. There's very little in Rawls himself about animals, but what is there is much more promising towards the end of a theory of justice than anything I think that we can get out of political liberalism. And on the intergenerational aspect, yes, I mean, Rawls is incredibly interesting about intergenerational justice, that passage that appears halfway through a theory of justice, and people are still puzzling over. And some people see that as being an opportunity for talking about climate change and climate justice in future generations. It's possible that you can do that. That's not what Rawls was intending, I don't think. But again, like everything else, this is something that Rawls scholars argue about. I think what he's thinking about is leaving enough and as good for future generations, and I'm just deliberately using the Lockean terminology, so that they can also live in conditions of justice. So I don't think it's specifically about climate, but it might be indirectly about climate, and so forth. And just on the question of liberation, this might not be satisfying to you, but one of the things that strikes me as being really quite radical about Rawls, I think there's a lot that's much more radical about Rawls than people recognize, is that his goal in Justice and Fairness is to imagine a society that people could experience from birth to death and all the way through between those 2 points as a place that they have chosen to be. So that when you think about that ambition, it's quite remarkable. It's about minimizing people's awareness and experience of coercion and limitation. You can't escape your society by leaving it, because there's very little. Rawls thinks about the just society as a closed society, so you can't escape it, except I suppose by suicide, and that's not a great escape. How you can craft for yourself a society that you can feel you have lived in freely and by choice all your life. Now, again, that's not quite liberation, but it seems to me like a pretty radical ambition of freedom to me.
Thank you, Ruth. There is Geetanjali who wanted to ask a question, but she has got a problem with her mic. I can repeat what she has written. She's primarily raising the question of Rawls' silence on internalized gender-based conception of the self. I think later Martha Nussbaum has picked it up on entrenched deprivation. And Geetanjali is requesting if you have a response to that silence of John Rawls.
I think the silence is real, absolutely. I don't think that was something that was really on his radar. I don't think it's something that he would have easily recognized. And here again, I think we have to make huge allowances for the fact that he was a man of his generation. And given that, when you compare him to some of the other towering figures of his generation, he took considerable steps to incorporate and accommodate feminism compared to some of the other people of the same stature as him. And let me just say as a footnote, he credits primarily his female students for raising his awareness in this regard. So yes, I agree, he is silent about that, absolutely. So then the question would be, are there resources within the theory that he didn't develop, but that others can develop to help to address this? And some of the adaptive preferences concerns can help to do that. There's some literature on that. Someone like Elizabeth Brake and others would argue that self-respect as a primary good is something that can also help with that. And that can also help with some of the internalized sense of inferiority that accompanies race in racist societies, like the one that I live in. So I think there it's a question about resources rather than what Rawls actually addressed himself on this issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Satvik, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. You have to excuse my ignorance on this topic. The idea of family and institution of marriage and the role played by the women. In my understanding, it has changed over time. It has been changing, and it will change. So if we look at Rawls' theory of justice, one of the way to look at it is it's had a fixed set of principles of justice. So this is what Amartya Sen calls transcendental institutionalism. So how, you have to excuse my ignorance, please. How do feminist theory reconcile with Rawls' fixed position on justice? Because the idea and the roles of marriage, family, these are evolving, right? So we do not know where it will go. We don't even know clearly what it was like 600 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Thank you.
It's a good question. And it's one of the areas of feminist debate about Rawls. Some of his early feminist interpreters thought that he was working with a fairly fixed and static view of the family as a heterosexual entity with two parents of different sexes and children, and that's it. There wouldn't be a kind of extended family or anything like that. And if that's the case, then that clearly is going to limit his use for thinking about the role of the family because it's changing, as you say. But Rawls has done some work to try to clarify that because, as I said, some of his feminist interpreters did push him on that. And he claims that he's fairly flexible about what form the family takes. Again, Nussbaum has leveled this criticism at him for coming up with what is a culturally specific form of the family. And he wants to argue that so long as the family fulfills its function in terms of preparing people to be citizens in a just society, then he's really kind of indifferent about the form that it takes. So that opens up, at least for some commentators, the possibility of Rawls being okay with marriage equality, so same-sex marriage, and presumably same-sex adoption of children as well. Yeah, so his focus becomes what is the function of the family, in which case it can be flexible about changing family forms. And one of the really fascinating things about part 3 of the theory of justice is really the central role he gives to the family as the first school of justice for the child. And the family's key role is to make the child feel loved. And lots of different families can do that. But as feminist interpreters point out, lots of families have failed at that as well. So that potentially gives you some way of paying attention to troublesome families as source of violence and deprivation and hardship and distortion for women and children as well. So I'm not sure if that answered your question. Also, you were talking about the fixed form of the two principles of justice, and that's certainly true, but they're very general, those principles of justice. So that also makes them quite flexible.
We have exceeded our time, but we have one more participant who wants to ask a question. I hope you don't mind taking that question. Gauri, please go ahead, ask.
Yes, I'm really sorry that my video is not working, so I apologize if this comes like it's only my voice and it's highly impersonal. But my question is about, I think Susan Orkin in her discussion, in her article on the family, outlines a lot of contributions made about justice from people such as Hume, Rousseau, as well as Rawls. And in clarifying certain contentions to his theory, Rawls said that justice is not the highest of moral virtues, but it is the most essential. And there are other moral virtues, such as the notion of self-sacrificing or other supererogatory ideas, supererogatory moral virtues that supersede justice as moral virtues. So I wanted to understand this claim better and the implications this can have for feminist decision making in particular, because there are certain situations in which, you know, self-sacrificing, you know, especially in heteronormative patriarchal societies, where self-sacrificing is often at the cost of justice. So self-sacrifice, so for say a woman to go ahead and not pursue an economic opportunity for the benefit of you know, staying home and taking care of her children, which is in a lot of cultures a patriarchal notion, it is incompatible with justice, or, you know, even self-actualization, which is often considered you know, important to justice. So would they so I just wanted to better understand how dethroning justice as a moral virtue, what implications does it have for decision making, and especially feminist decision making?
Yeah, great question. So it's the first virtue, justice is the first virtue of social institutions for Rawls, but that's not everything. So you're absolutely right. It's really important for principles of right, but it doesn't mean that it is the superior virtue in all of the virtues that humans can aspire to. But what he would say is that the state cannot mandate self-sacrifice, right? He's very clear about this. And he pits a theory of justice as really a debate between justice as fairness and utilitarianism. And he thinks that one of the great dangers of utilitarianism is that it does make room for self-sacrifice or the sacrifice of others. Other people can be disadvantaged if a majority gets pleasure or happiness from a particular form of social organization. So he's very, very strong about that. And that's where his moral individualism comes from. People often misunderstand what is meant by that. Nussbaum is very strong on this. It's the Kantian idea that each person is an end in themselves and that they should not be sacrificed for the benefit of other people. So if you freely choose to self-sacrifice, then so be that, and we can admire you if you want, and if we want, but the state cannot require that of you because of the moral individualism and the whole social contract idea. Now, in terms of women and their tendency to self-sacrifice, absolutely. This is something that gets picked up by Jean Hampton a lot. She takes on the whole ethic of care that developed from Carol Gilligan onward, and she agrees that that is very important, but she also sees it as being slightly dangerous if women are just socialized into caring and not paying attention to the cost that might come with that to them. So she's saying, you know, people should not make themselves a prey to other people's propensity to exploit or take advantage or anything like that. So I think there are very strong resources within Rawls and his feminist interpreters to grapple with that range of questions. Absolutely. I hope that's answered your question.
Great. It was a great session, Ruth. Wonderful to have you and to patiently listen to the question and to engage with them. It was a great session for all of us. Thank you everyone for participating in this. Next session in our series is on 18th of August, where we will be extending some of the discussions we had today, that is particularly that of the question of environment and roles. Today we touched on the questions of intergenerational justice. So we will be expanding on that in the next session on 18th August. So you will all get the invitation through email for that. Thank you very much, particularly Ruth and all the participants and those who contributed in terms of reflections and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for your attention. Bye.